Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, as I said, this is a very different kind of Sunday morning, and if you'll forgive me, I just wanted to start with a few thoughts of my own, because this is the most dramatic and important democratic decision ever taken by the British people. But it leaves our country deeply divided. It's not just the overall numbers, the 17 million leavers against the 16 million stayers. The minute you dig down at all into the data, you find that poorer areas with more unskilled and semi-skilled workers and more pensioners were much likelier to vote leave. The map of the results shows a yawning gap between the posher, better educated and richer parts of Britain, London, some of the city centres elsewhere, university towns and so on, and the huge swathes of post-industrial, ex-mining and struggling fishing and agricultural Britain. Whatever the politicians tell us, right at the moment, we are not one country. Now, none of this should come as a surprise, nor can we really blame today's campaigners. For the past 50 years, we have seen a decline in heavy industrial, making things, exporting Britain, and the rise in service industries, banking and culture, which mopped up some of the lost jobs. Under our last 5 prime ministers, we became a shopping nation. London boomed as a global centre, while, ignored by too much of the political and media class, places like industrial Wales, the Black Country and struggling coastal towns became ever poorer, ever more desolate. Meanwhile, waves of migration and globalised culture washed among us, eroding our sense of self. Whole communities changed colour and language, leaving older people bemused and cut off. As the numbers from Eastern Europe rose, eager, white, hard-working, new neighbours, alarm grew in the poorer parts of the country. But the self-confidently, multi-ethnic, liberal, urban class, high on high house prices and high employment levels, was having such a good time they barely noticed. London spoke a lot, but didn't listen. Well, it's heard now. This has been the rebellion of the diminished against the cocky, the ignored against the shapers of modern times, and the struggling against the strutting. This revolt has taken us out of Europe with huge consequences for the rest of the EU. It has also taken out the leadership of the governing party and may soon remove the leadership of the opposition party as well. In the House of Commons today, nobody has a clear majority, and whatever administration is cobbled together over the next weeks and months, it will surely struggle for real authority. We are still today a lucky country, able to fashion our own future and with a wonderful history. But we are also divided, full of bad feelings and in choppy seas, still searching around for a rudder. Andrew Neil has been following events from Westminster around the clock, part of the vast media encampment opposite the Houses of Parliament. He will be hosting the Sunday Politics from there immediately after this programme. Andrew, what's your view on this extraordinary day?
Well, Andrew, Britain's crossed the most significant political watershed in my lifetime. It's not so much a new chapter in our island story as a brand new volume. Nobody knows the ending. There will be challenges, some of which we haven't even yet recognised. But the European Union faces problems of its own. Euroscepticism is on the rise from Italy to Portugal, Holland to Scandinavia, and already endemic in Greece. Almost everywhere, pro-EU parties of the centre-left and centre-right are in retreat, harried and sometimes even defeated by more radical voices from the nativist right and the neo-Marxist left. Anti-Brussels sentiment is at British levels across northwest Europe. In France, the EU is now even less popular than it is here in Blighty, causing German officials to fret about the future. Thursday's Brexit vote, far from being a case of British exceptionalism, could well be the first serious rebellion in a pan-European uprising against the EU project as currently constituted. Now, this is not to say it will trigger a rush to the exit. I doubt that. But it does suggest business as usual in Brussels will only fan rebel flames. The EU, almost as much as the UK, is now in uncharted territory. It's probably in the interest of Brussels and London that neither loses its way.
Hard to disagree with any of that. And now to the papers, as usual. The front pages have got lots of interesting stories. There's a huge petition at the moment for people who want a second referendum. 2.6 million people so far have signed it. But the Sunday Mirror has Nigel Farage saying it's not the best of three. You're not going to get that. He might have had a different view had things gone the other way, I suppose. The Express in defiantly cheerful mood. Triple boost as UK begins Brexit, it says. And The Sun has the dirty side of this story, Project Smear, people trying to smear Boris. There's a lot of talk of a Stop Boris campaign, and we'll discuss that more in the paper review. There he is again, playing cricket, whacking a ball very vigorously, or perhaps missing a ball very vigorously. You can't tell from the photograph. Tories battle to stop Boris, their headline there. The Observer, Boris again. He needs to lose a little bit of weight, Boris. UK faces Brexit crisis as Europe's leaders demand... Get out now. Sorry. That's an unbiased statement of the truth. And finally, Sunday Telegraph, Tories at war. A very tough, clear headline. And I think we're going to start with that one. But before I do, I better show you also the Sunday Times. The Tories, top Tories rush to stop Boris bandwagon. And then they've got shadow cabinet in Corbyn coup plot. Another story we'll be talking about today. Tim, start us on the papers. You've got the Sunday Telegraph.
Yes, it's that story, the Tories at war, and really the enormity of today. This could have been Labour at war. It could have been Britain at war. You know, back to your or Europe at war.
Yeah.
You know, the volume and significance of the stories that we are seeing, and the Prime Minister has just resigned. And if you look through the papers, there's almost very little on that, his time as Prime Minister. The news has completely overtaken events, yeah.
One thing, Tim, it seems to me at the moment that almost nobody has a clear majority in the House of Commons now. As it were, the defeated Remain Tories don't, but the Brexit Tories don't either. And there is this weird sense of drift. Nobody's in charge. At the top of the programme I was saying that. Do you agree with that?
I think that's true, and I think it's one of the reasons why I think Labour is moving so quickly, but it seems to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, because I think the new Tory leader won't make the mistake that Gordon Brown made when he took over from Tony Blair. As long as the opinion polls give that new leader a bounce, I think that new Tory leader will go to the country quite quickly to try and get a mandate so that they are able to implement the kind of Brexit negotiations they want to.
Because there is a legitimacy question, isn't there? It's a Conservative leader the country didn't choose, and it's standing on a manifesto, much of which the country hadn't voted for either. 3/4
of the Parliament's MPs are pro-Remain, and they've been given instructions by the people to do something that is clearly against their instincts. Now, a lot of MPs will obey that instruction from the British people, but a lot of people are so committed to the European project that they will try and frustrate it. So I think a lot of Brexit Tory MPs think a general election, as well as this referendum, will be needed to push Parliament in the direction they think it needs to go.
Laura is going to be a very, very busy woman over the summer, I'm afraid. Polly, I was mentioning the division in the country, and those maps really show it. You've picked the Observer here.
The maps really do show it. I mean, I just want to say a word about the Sunday papers. They have plunged immediately into the inside the Beltway, Westminster, who's up, who's down, runners and riders for Labour, for Tories. I think they haven't paused enough to consider the absolutely cataclysmic enormity, which you grasped plainly at the beginning of this programme, of quite how huge this is, what a seismic change in a direction we don't know where it's going. But there are some very good analyses here, and I think this one by Rob Ford in The Observer is excellent. He's an extremely good analyst about who has voted what. And here we have the divide between the political class, the rest, between London and the rest of London, the rest of England. And we have the old and the young. The young very angry. 75% of the young voted to remain. The old seem to have taken control in a way that's rather surprising.
They always do, they vote. That's the
no, but what's surprising is that usually they're the ballast, the stabilisers. This time they've been the rebels, they've been the anarchists, they've been the throw it all apart. Whereas the young have said, let's hold on to what we've got.
They are the wise ones. They have seen through our 40-year history in the European Union, politicians always saying, Europe's about to come our way, the reform's about to happen. They know not to have believed these promises, and they've done the young a favour in saying, this project's doomed.
To be old is not necessarily to be wise, is what we've learnt this time.
We all know that, Polly. We're all getting to that stage. Laura, Polly said the papers hadn't grasped the sense of the enormity of it. I think that's generally true, but the Observer's front page has some sense of that, doesn't it?
Indeed, and the Observer is basically saying, well, you know what, Britain, you might have voted out, the rest of the EU is going to take if that's what you want, you're going to get it quickly. Now, the point here is that all the way through the campaign, David Cameron was saying, I will trigger Article 50 immediately, the process that would actually take us out of the European Union. The Leavers were saying, oh, calm down, we'd have a period of informal chats when we'd work out how it would happen.
And they still are.
Well, and they're still hoping that that's the case, because, of course, David Cameron changed his mind and said it doesn't have to happen immediately. But our near neighbours are saying, well, tough. You've decided we want to get on with it.
They may want to get on with it, but it's not really in their control. It is in our control when Article 50 is triggered. And to be clear, the reason against triggering it quickly, because that gives us a 2-year window once it starts to run.
Absolutely.
That means time is short and will weaken Britain's hand in those negotiations. So it's in Britain's interest to delay before that's triggered.
That's exactly the case, and that's part of the reason why David Cameron felt actually he had to go, is because he thought there only could be authority in these negotiations if the new Prime Minister was the person to lead those negotiations. And you're quite right, only the British Prime Minister can actually press the button on this. But just a sense, though, of how we will not really be in charge of this process already. David Cameron has to go to a summit in Brussels this week. He's already been uninvited from the session on the Wednesday. He'll only be permitted to go to the meeting on Tuesday, because the crucial thing about this Article 50 process is that Britain, or any departing country for that matter, is outside the room.
Yes.
Which is quite astonishing.
But David Cameron has to say to them, in terms, probably through a letter, I now trigger Article 50. It doesn't happen by accident, as it were.
That's right.
Now, Tim, there's a lot of doom and gloom in the papers, a lot of worry. You've picked a very chirpy column from the Sunday Times.
Yes, I think Polly earlier described the decision the British people took as cataclysmic, was, I think, the word she chose. But all Britain has done in the referendum is we have chosen to be like most countries in the world. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. Countries that do very well without being part of a supranational structure. Nobody around the world is copying the EU model because they've seen the unemployment it has led to across the southern part of the continent. They've seen its inability to make decisions in the kind of meetings that Laura described. If you had 28 people around any kind of table, it's very difficult to get agreement. Rowan Silver's piece is a really lovely, optimistic piece. 90% of our export growth is with non-EU countries. This is the world we are now connecting ourselves to. It's vital, of course, we have good and successful negotiations with the EU about our relationship with them. But we will now be able to negotiate trade arrangements with new countries, and France won't be able to veto them. Denmark won't be able to veto them. We are now, as the slogan says, in control of our destiny in a way we weren't in the past.
And this is interesting, particularly because Rohan was in the Remain camp, I think, during the referendum. And
yes.
he's seeing the silver linings very glintingly.
Yes, and a real ally of Steve Hilton, of course, was one of the most passionate Brexiteers.
Polly, you've taken a rather different view. Nick Cohen from the
Yes.
Observer.
Nick Cohen in the Observer says what trouble there is ahead, because the people will feel they've been swindled. The numbers of lies, and he's very specific about this, that Johnson and Gove and the Leave campaign told, were immediately denied. Within hours, you had them coming out saying, well, actually, we're not going to change migration that much, which was the real motivator.
Both sides told lies. Both sides smeared, got down into the gutter and demeaned themselves, in my view.
In your view, the BBC always has to be on the one hand or the other. It's a flat earth or it's a round earth. The BBC stands in the middle. But the truth is that what was promised to people, particularly, was migration. Immediately they're saying, oh, well, I'm not sure we will stop having that many EU migrants. People will be outraged if that promise isn't kept. The 350 million a week, oh, no, we don't think that's coming back, and it's certainly not going to the NHS. And Farage saying, well, we shouldn't have promised that anyway. So all of the main things that stuck in people's minds made them vote for Leave. They're going to be betrayed. They're going to know they've been swindled.
Let's wait and see. They will deliver on this.
If you're looking across the papers, the overwhelming sense is that the entire British political class has been kind of toppled by this. And it's not just the Tory party, Laura, it's the Labour Party, as we'll hear later on as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, for people who have been privately critical of Jeremy Corbyn for a long time in the shadow cabinet, they now see this is their moment. Of course, the accusation is that Jeremy Corbyn didn't do enough to get Remain-tending Labour voters out in the campaign. And inside the Telegraph, we have a description of how Labour MPs have been plotting to get Jeremy Corbyn out. And we're already in the territory of runners and riders of the potential people who might take over from him.
One person who's not there is Hilary Benn, who was sacked overnight. He's coming on the programme later on to explain why. Is it your sense that a coup is now underway?
Yes. Whether it will be successful is quite a different matter. But Hilary Benn was sacked overnight because he told Jeremy Corbyn that he didn't have confidence in his leadership. Now, in the last hour, Heidi Alexander, less well known, but who was the Shadow Health Secretary, has also resigned. Now, her resignation, I think, is critical in this. We knew that Hilary Benn and Jeremy Corbyn came to blows over Syria. We knew that they had been at loggerheads. We know that Jeremy Corbyn tried to fire him a few months ago and failed to do so. But Heidi Alexander has not been a public...
Different kettle of fish.
Exactly.
Do you think we'll see more, therefore, resignations today?
I think this morning there will be more resignations from other members of the Shadow Cabinet. Now, what happens after that...
Big question.
Is a very, very big question.
I was going to ask you, because at one level this whole thing seems to be completely futile, because this has to be an election of the entire Labour membership, and they are overwhelmingly, even now, behind Jeremy Corbyn. There's yet another petition to back Jeremy Corbyn. And as long as his name's on the ballot paper, or John McDonnell's name on the ballot paper, that is who the Labour Party looks like they're going to choose.
Well, there are two critical things here. If you talk to Jeremy Corbyn's team, they say he will stand again, and automatically he has the right to be on the ballot paper. Now, forgive me for going into the weeds of Labour Party rules, but there is disagreement over that. There is differing legal advice.
And it goes back to Hilary Benn's dad, who stood against Neil Kinnock back in the day.
Yes. There is a different overview. Jeremy Corbyn's team are confident he automatically gets on the ballot paper. There are people in the Labour Party who take a different view. So first off, there might be an almighty row over whether or not he has an automatic right to stand. Second of all, you're right, the assumption at the moment is that the new members of the Labour Party, who Jeremy Corbyn so enthused last summer, who pulled off an amazing feat by getting nearly 200,000 people to join the party. That's astonishing in these times.
And it wasn't long ago.
It wasn't long ago. The assumption is that they are still overwhelmingly backing him. In the last 48 hours, though, don't underestimate how unhappy some Labour MPs and some Labour Party members are about the decision of people to leave the European Union and about this campaign.
There's a poll today, sorry to jump in, there's a poll today, I think, showing that 29% of Labour voters say they will not vote Labour at the next election. Where they'll go instead, we don't know. But
you have to remember how few Labour voters there were anyway at the last election. So to lose a third, I mean, that is a real crisis for Labour. And if that's, and that's what's motivating. I mean, nobody knows who might come up as candidates next. And it hardly matters whether it's somebody of left or right. They just need somebody who looks as if they can lead, who can galvanise, who can inspire. And I think the left-right business will be less important than who has some charisma.
I want to jump from Labour sadness to Tory sadness and Tim Montgomery in a moment, Tory difficulties. But before we do, Polly, you've got the Sunday Post, Dundee's great national newspaper, on your iPad there. 59% yes for a Scottish independence vote.
Will that be enough? I mean, Nicola Sturgeon has been very wisely saying she's not going to go for another referendum unless she knows she's going to win it. So she's got to know she's got an overwhelming majority.
If she gets that for 2 weeks, then that'll be enough, won't it?
Well, who knows? I mean, who knows if that's enough, because she will lose some of that during the course of a campaign when they go back to what currency? Will it be the euro? What will it be? And when they go back to the oil price? I think she needs to have a very, very high yes poll like this for a very long time before she goes for it.
She also has to persuade Westminster, technically, to allow it to happen.
And Brussels, she had a bad time in Brussels as well.
Indeed. So
according to the Mail.
So Nicola Sturgeon has absolutely tried to seize this moment to be out in front, giving leadership, saying that this is what should happen next for Scotland. However, in Brussels, there's a question about whether or not part of one territory can say, well, actually, we want to stay in when the others are leaving.
Before we finish, and surprisingly, we don't have lots of jolly stories to do today, it's far too important. Tim, the other big leadership question is, of course, Boris Johnson. Had a fairly brutal headline there inside The Sun on Sunday. You've killed off Prime Minister, we will get you. Absolutely. How serious is the Get Bojo movement?
Very serious. And if you look at Tory party history, a year before Mrs Thatcher became leader, or Major became leader, or Cameron became leader, they weren't on the radar. The Tories often choose outsiders, and it's partly because they launch such ferocious onslaughts against the front runners in each of the races. And Boris, the weighty Boris, as I think we'll have to call him after your introduction earlier.
He's leading the charge.
I'm holding my tummy in there now as I do this press review. Boris is going to be subject to an awful lot of attacks over the next 2 or 3 weeks. huge numbers of Remain supporters inside the Conservative Party. We had John Major in this
But they're
studio
right, yeah.
a little while ago launching an
certainly
attack.
did.
Number 10 and number 11 feel very resentful. They think that he is the one that tipped this referendum decisively in favour of out, and they want revenge.
They want revenge. But also, isn't it the case that after what's happened and what happened in the referendum, the Tory party really has to be led by a Brexiteer? So, you know, people are trying to draft Theresa May, for instance, but she was on the other side of the argument.
Only just.
Only just.
Only just. And it would be
right.
very interesting. And lots of people think she's played this very wisely. But one just very
Okay.
important distinction. This is not just about who the Tory leader. This is who's going to be the Prime Minister. And 150,000 Conservative members are going
And
to
do
choose the Prime
people
Minister.
really
Okay.
think Boris is responsible enough to take that post? I think there'll be a lot of doubt
A
about
big question
that.
for a lot of people. Boris Johnson, the British people, the electorate, and all of our paper reviewers, thank you very much indeed.